I almost forgot to hit record. And on that note, Jen, for the people joining us today who may not know, what does your day-to-day look like as the person that gets to filter through all the hundreds of ag stories each week to get them in the newsletter?
Yeah, it looks like my phone just blowing up nonstop. Um, Depending on where we're at in the news cycle and how crazy things are, I am spending anywhere from, 30 minutes to 90 minutes a day just skimming through all of the ag centered and, sometimes it's a lot broader than that news and looking for trends, looking for any kind of patterns and what's going on, looking for things that maybe are a little bit different than what you might hear when you're listening to the radio on your way in, and just looking for things that spark and that would spark with our readers that are important for all sectors of the ag industry. And I kind of take those and I pull them all together, and then I let our awesome creative writers have at it. That way we can bring every Tuesday and Friday, we bring to your inbox a witty, fun take on what's important in the ag world right now.
So that's kind of a lengthy process for you, Jen. What is something that we all might be surprised about this curating process and how you bring all of these great stories into the magnetic newsletter?
So the fluidity of it, I know really caught me by surprise when I took on this role, and I've been in this role for a couple years now. Sometimes it really is dry. Sometimes we are in a slow news cycle. If there's any kind of national holiday going on, anything like that, that just kills the news cycle. And then it gets really dry and it can be like digging to find interesting stories. And then sometimes I am so overwhelmed with things that seem really important that it's hard to pick what is the most important, what is the most impactful. And then, not to be unpositive at a holiday time, but sometimes it can be depressing, when we're in a hard news cycle and we're in a time where all the news is bad and you're just filtering through like what can we talk about that doesn't suck, that isn't going to make people want to go drink and cry at 6 a.m. It can be a little depressing at times.
Something that we really love about magnetic is kind of the magnetic factor of the stories and that we kind of bring to life in the newsletter. So, what's the first signal when you see a new headline cross your desk that it has that magnetic factor and belongs in the weekly newsletter?
If the normies are talking about it, I know that it's definitely something we're gonna get into, and I listen to a lot of podcasts and read a lot of news that's outside the ag industry too. And so if the people that are not as deep in ag as we are talking about it, if the people that you can tell when they're talking about it or writing about it really don't have the depth of knowledge that those of us in the industry are, then I definitely know this is something that we're going to want to take our own stab at and make sure that it's being covered by those of us in the industry as well.
So speaking of that, I know we've alluded to there's a lot of headlines that you sift through to decide what makes it in, what doesn't make it in. Is there a headline that you saw this year that didn't make the cut, but that you absolutely loved? And could you kind of explain your process of what might have kept it out?
Yeah, so there's been actually a lot of talk about GLP-1s actually, and the way they are impacting the broader food industry. The grocery stores have come out and really talked about how they're taking a hit. And a lot of the kind of snack food sector and junk food sector have been very open about the fact that they are seeing a decline in sales and that they feel like a lot of this is directly connected to the GLP-1s and to Ozempic and the increasing popularity of that. We didn't cover it because it kind of goes into that gray area of what truly is ag, right? And what people are consuming, obviously, is going to impact the ag industry. But where is the line, right, on what we cover as truly agriculture? And, I work with a lot of FFA kids, and we have that conversation in that realm too about what really is ag and what isn't. And at a certain point, you just kind of have to decide, well, I guess we'll go ahead and cover this or we won't. And so that didn't, I felt like, quite meet the line for what was worth digging into deep from an ag perspective, but it was certainly interesting and something that I had not ever considered, that everybody going on Ozempic and losing a bunch of weight was gonna impact the snack food industry. Of course it is, but it wasn't something I had thought about.
Wasn't on your bingo card anyway,
It
as
was not.
we like to say. Let's kind of flip this question around. There's obviously a lot of good in the ag headlines as well. So, do you ever know something is instantly gonna be good, and like requires that extra digging and research to make it into the newsletter?
Yeah. So if people are fighting about it on social media, I'm like there. I want to know what exactly is happening. And it's not because I like the fight or because I'm looking for clickbait or anything like that. But I've really found that issues are rarely as black and white as we like to think about them. As people, we like to put things in a box of good or bad, and we don't like to sit on that cognitive dissonance that really is kind of what's going on typically. And so anytime I see like lines being drawn and people are really getting into it on two different sides, I want to make sure that we are there covering the whole story, right? And making sure that everyone sees that this issue is maybe more than what the fight on social media is. Social media is great, but it doesn't often give us the accurate picture. And so if I see it blowing up, it's like, okay, let's see what the facts are and how we can get those out there.
How do you kind of manage that? Like, there are a lot of topics in ag that are very polarizing. So, how do you make sure that you're like getting the truthful information out and kind of balancing the line of both sides?
It's so hard because, in addition to this job, I'm a rancher, right? I have a cow-calf operation out in Nebraska. And so I try to be very, very aware that that's where I'm at, right? I'm going to see things through the lens that is my lived experience, of course. But I think that the way we have set up magnetic ag really helps to make sure that everybody's perspectives are in check. I'm not writing the story most of the time, right? I'm assigning the topic and providing sources to our writers. Our writers come from such a wide background within the industry. We've got all sorts of sectors. We've got ag teachers, we've got other people in production, we've got people that are very much in the ag business world working for corporate ag. And so, they're able to balance those things too with their own perspectives. And then we've got a wonderful, wonderful editor who does a really good job of calling us on it whenever we have something in there that it's like, this feels a little biased. We need to check this. And so we've got so many eyes on it before it actually even goes out in the newsletter that I think we do a pretty good job of making sure our bias doesn't come through, that there is no bias in it. And we're all pretty aware of who we are and what we're coming from, that we keep each other in check pretty well, I think.
And just from my experience watching on the back end, Jen, I would definitely echo that sentiment. So we're going to move into a new segment, kind of talking about some different top stories of 2025 in different categories. So the first one we're going to move into is what we're going to call markets and money moves. As we all know, high cattle prices, grain volatility, input cost pressures, economic stories kind of ruled lots of crazy headlines in 2025. So Jen, what market story from 2025 made you feel like we might be entering a new era of economics for ag?
So again, my perspective as a rancher might kind of impact the answer because this was most impactful to me personally as well. But you just said it, the high cattle prices. I think um and it's not so much that prices are high that is a new era, but the infighting within the beef supply chain about who is due the biggest piece of that pie has been absolutely wild. And it's not that we've never been there before, right? Cow-calf guys get mad at feeders, get mad at packers. That's always been a thing, but it does feel like it's ratcheting up and it's going national. When they're talking about that pie, about the beef supply chain pie on national news. On the farming side of things, I think there's been so much back and forth with China, of course. China's agreement to buy soybeans has been really interesting to watch. There was a big sigh of relief when they made it, and then, the follow through has been kind of interesting. They have been very slow to make a lot of those purchases that they agreed to. And so I think that there's going to be some broader conversation that comes out of that as well.
Okay, kind of switching gears into the next big headline that or talking point, I guess, that we wanted to focus on today is technology and innovation. We know our readers love it. Braeden and I also like to geek out about it, so we want your thoughts, Jen. What innovation headline genuinely surprised you through technology innovation over the past year?
So, having done this for several years, the thing that really surprised me in tech in 2025 was the lack of in the headlines. In 23 and 24, we saw a ton of venture capital raised. We saw a ton of interest and focus put into all the different tech sides. I mean, there were new companies left and right all over the nation. Well, and I mean, a ton of international ones that were getting into the game. And then it seemed like this year things kind of dried up. There's been a lack of fundraising going on. I think we've got some lack of innovation. We've seen quite a few of the companies go belly up and say we can't do this anymore. So the thing that I really noticed this year in the tech has been the lack of it.
That might make this next question a little more challenging, but I think it'll make it fun. Is that so? Are there any technologies? I'll split this into two questions for you. Okay. Were there any technologies you felt were maybe overhyped or maybe weren't as cool as they might have seemed based on the headline?
So not necessarily technology that was overhyped, but threat from a technology that was overhyped. There was this big panic earlier this year about the drones from China, that they were going to be spying, so we needed to clamp down on the drone technology coming over. And that was kind of interesting. And then it very quickly like fizzled out, and everybody realized, oh, no, we're probably okay to be spraying crops with drones. That's not necessarily the threat that we thought it was.
And the second question, what do you think maybe from this aspect had kind of like a quiet big impact that people might have went under the radar a little bit?
There's a lot of cool technology coming out in soil development that I think everyone's been very quiet about. Their university research studies, don't get quite the press that the big venture capitalist kind of ones do. But there's some really interesting things about some soil additives that I'm just hearing little buzzing about that will be kind of interesting to see how that plays out in 2026. There's a lot of focus on being able to manage crops for the changing climate. And if they can get some of the soil stuff nailed down, I think that'll make a huge difference.
Awesome. I do love when we pull some awesome research studies from universities and extension, and you realize, oh wow, these boots on the ground kind of work that's happening is really awesome and is doing good work.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to move to some more fun topics, maybe some policy, weather, or global events. So I know there's been a lot of talk about policies and tensions and things throughout the year with magnetic. We've seen it showed up in our surveys. Jen, we've even had conversations about it as far as like what are the readers really going to want to hear and what do they need to hear. So which policy story had the widest real world implication for producers?
So, I mean, of course it's tariffs, right? And we're all tired of hearing that word. And I promise I'm tired of typing that word because it seems like it's all that we have had to talk about. But it is so important for producers to know what's going on with tariff policy. Whatever they're deciding, this week can drastically impact how and when you should market your commodities. We've seen the markets completely collapse and then completely rebound and then completely collapse again, all in the matter of a couple of months based on what the White House is putting out there as their tariff policy. And so the tariffs news cycle is never ending and can sometimes feel like, watching paint dry and then it'll explode and then it dries again. But it is so important for producers to be aware of where those tariffs sit, especially as you're approaching whether it's harvest or whenever you market your livestock. It is so important that they are aware of where things are sitting.
Jen, you kind of alluded to this earlier, but policy as a whole is just so big and so massive, and it affects so many people in so many different ways. So I imagine it's pretty hard to kind of simplify that into digestible little bits to go into the newsletter. Was there a story in 2025 that was particularly hard to really simplify and make more digestible?
So there's a couple. Anytime they start talking about renewable energy quotas and allowances, that stuff is so complicated. But if you're a corn farmer out there, it really matters to you. It's very much going to impact the price. And so that can be really, really hard to break down and to make interesting, frankly. And then the recent aid package that was just announced this last week, it's been really wild because it got picked up by a lot of, what I call normies, and then turned into this whole weird, like, poor farmers need a welfare check thing without anybody really digging into the numbers and understanding that big number looks big. But when you divvy that out, it's actually a pretty small number per producer, and it's not going to change those producers' annual outcome on their operation, even though it feels so large. And then that story started to break down into, well, how is this going to impact equipment manufacturers? And that's still kind of developing right now. And so that'll add a whole nother complicated layer to it.
Okay, and the final, I guess, key point that we really wanted to dive in with you this today, Jen, it's just those real human stories. I mean, agriculture is centered around the people. So, of all of the mental health, community resistant type stories that Magnetic covered this year, which one has stayed with you and really impacted kind of the way you see the humans in ag or just agriculture?
Yeah, so and again, this is coming from my perspective as a rancher, but the Maud family in South Dakota, when they were charged this year with land theft for the 50 acres that was on the wrong side of a, 200-year-old fence, and they were looking at legit jail time because of where this fence had been, that really stuck with me. And I was so proud of our industry because we rallied behind them right? And that story went everywhere, and eventually those charges were dropped, and that family was allowed to continue their operations. But that just really sat with me about, the things that these small little stories that can really ruin a generational operation. It's important that people realize those things happen.
That is also one of my favorite stories of the year as well, Jen. I definitely felt that one. So I think you've kind of alluded to this a little bit, but why do you think the magnetic readers respond so strongly to these type of stories?
I think we can all see ourselves in them. Whether it's, a horrible, the horrible deaths that happened at the dairy farm in Colorado earlier this year, right? We're all involved in this industry, and we can all see ourselves in these situations, or people we know anyway. We could see that so easily happening to our loved ones, to our operations, that it's hard not to feel connected.
I definitely think Magnetic does a good job of that human element as well. I mean, I love reading all the stories, but sometimes it's that little extra hit of human that feel extra special, especially in the ag industry. All right, so Jen, you've talked about how, from your perspective, this, that, and the other, and you, of course, are the curator and have a big hand in the editorial process with Magnetic. So let's turn on our journalism caps here a little bit, and we're going to get in the weeds a little bit. So, do you have a headline this year that for you was like super hard to craft or decide on like which headline is right for Magnetic to use, like from a writing
It
perspective?
happens. It happens anytime there's something that's tragic. Like I just mentioned, the deaths that happened in the dairy grain bins earlier this fall. Anytime there's something tragic, that can be really hard because our goal at Magnetic, right, is to be witty, and we try to put kind of a fun edge on things. And that's our branding. And so whenever there's something that is tragic, that is sad, we have to turn that off. And that can make it really hard to craft a headline that matches with who we are, and with the fact that we're trying to make you smile as you're getting that news. But also at this point, we need to kind of put that on pause and tell you something tragic. That's tricky.
I You just said that a big piece of Magnetic is being fun and witty, but I would also say that we're bold and like really out there with some of the way that we talk about things and just the headlines that are covered in Magnetic. Do you ever go back and forth on whether something is like too bold or not bold enough, especially like when we're talking about those polarizing stories and big headlines?
Mostly with the gifts that we use. You know, I love those because I think you can actually make a really, really sharp statement with these tiny little clips. They're actually really impactful, but I have to rein myself in, and I will occasionally send them up the chain and say, "Hey, do you think this is too much?" I remind myself too, we actually have a lot of high school FFA members that are readers, and would I want my high school FFA member to have this pop up on their phone, kind of filtering it through that too? So mostly actually that's where we get the most playful, and where I have to kind of keep in check, is this too much?
It's definitely a interesting process. We always talk about playing the line and how far across the line are we going to let ourselves go. So thank you for helping stay on top of that. Better you than me, probably. Okay, Jen, just to give some context into kind of the back end of how Magnetic runs for our listeners here, I know and you know there's kind of a running list of topics and headlines and story links that the team works off of to kind of decide what goes in the newsletter. And I know some of those stories kind of stay in there as more interest pieces and not hard-hitting news. But at what point do some of those stories move from, oh, that's just something interesting to, hey, we have to cover this?
So, there's a lot of things that I stash for later that maybe nobody's picking up quite yet, right? And then something will ignite. And whether that's a slow news cycle and suddenly everybody's looking for something to cover, or a new breakthrough in some technology. Right now, I'm sitting on a story about some technology that they're starting to use in packing plants monitoring welfare. Okay. That just got picked up by a new packing plant. So all of a sudden, this technology that I've been sitting on for a little bit, thinking this is interesting, but maybe not important enough, not being used enough, not adopted enough to matter yet. It got adopted overnight. Boom. People should know that this exists.
I think that's so fun that you kind of get to really pay attention as stories plays out. And then we get to reap the benefits of it at the end. So kind of shifting gears, 2026, hard to believe, is right around the corner. Um, if you had to place a bet on one headline, one story that's really gonna shape the ag industry in 2026, where are you placing that bet?
I think we're going to see a rescue package for equipment manufacturers. And I think that conversation is going to get pretty wild once it's proposed. Again, it's going to pull out some of that inner industry squabbling. And it's hard because you can see all sides of it. You look at there's a lot of equipment manufacturers and one big green one in particular that have had to do a lot of layoffs in the last year. And we've covered that. We've talked about that. And they've all been hit by the tariffs. But then on the other hand, you've got a lot of producers, especially those small and mid-sized ones who look at the price tags on some of that equipment and think, well, that's not sustainable either. And when that package comes through, that rescue package for them, if it comes through, I think there will be some very interesting conversations that surround that we will be hearing about for a while.
All right, that's you kind of backed into this question a little bit, but what trends do you think people in ag are probably sleeping on right now that we're probably going to see pop up in some headlines?
I think we're going to see increased conversation on a completely different note on genetic competition from South America, especially in the livestock sector. There's been a lot of news this year about the way South America is competing on crops, especially soybeans. We've covered that a lot this year, but what we haven't covered a lot and that I see kind of building is genetic competition on livestock. There's a lot of AI that's going on in South America. They're becoming a massive semen importer from North America, and that's going to change the way those ranchers down there are able to compete with the ranchers here, especially as we start discussing increasing imports from South America. I believe that that's gonna blow up at some point.
Awesome, awesome. All right, now we have just a few random out of the bag questions for you. So my first one is, what is your absolute favorite headline that Magnetic did this year, and kind of what was the story?
So that's a really hard one because
This one
our
makes
writers
sense.
are awesome. Yeah. And they come up with some of the most creative, witty headlines. But one of my favorites was we had a headline that was super scarecrows fight for bird flu with lasers. And it just sounds so wild, right? But when you go down into that story, it was that there were some companies developing lasers essentially that go out and scare the birds away, and that's how they were going to go ahead and keep avian flu at bay. But super scarecrows fight off bird flu with lasers definitely was a fun headline, and a fun gift to look for.
I'm sure that one definitely stopped some people as they were skimming their inboxes. Okay, our next fun question. If you have listened to Magnetic Ag, I'm a huge our Ears Edition podcast, I'm a huge coffee guru. So let's have a little bit of fun with this one. Which coffee or which story throughout this year made you spill your coffee, either metaphorically or literally?
So I will say I was traveling when this story hit. I was stranded at the Chicago O'Hare Airport. And if you haven't been to that airport, it is not a fun one to be stranded in by any means. And I was sitting there surrounded by a bunch of people who have nothing to do with the ag industry. And Trump tweeted out about ranchers. And I mean, I stopped what I was doing and was just like, what? I mean, how do you even begin to cover the president tweeting about the American rancher? That stopped me in my tracks. And I'm sure people around me thought that I was absolutely insane because there was some noises being made.
Definitely, I remember exactly where I was moment, especially for you in that situation.
Yes.
So another one fun one, I always think about this. I think my answers to these always change all the time, but which ag figure or maybe ag industry leader would you love to have the opportunity to interview at some point?
So like you, I that's definitely changing all the right now. I think sitting down with Brooke Rollins would be super interesting, and not to discuss any kind of policy stuff, but I would love to dig into some of the comments and statements that she's made about FFA, right? Like I did not have the ag secretary deciding to take on FFA at all in my mind as something that we would be thinking about this year. But I think that would be so interesting just to hear where she's coming from and what she thinks her role in that conversation is. That would be a worthwhile conversation, I think.
I would also have to say she's on my list of people to interview. So great pick. Okay, last question in our lightning round. If you had to describe 2025 ag news in one word, what is that word?
Chaos.
Can you
I
explain?
mean, well, yeah, the markets have been completely chaotic. You know, really just chaos. Our policy changes nonstop. It's it's been a good year to be in the news industry just because there's so much of it, but it's definitely been chaotic.
All right, Jen, the hard part's over. Just kidding. Maybe the hard part's starting. So, if anyone has any questions for Jen, feel free to start popping them in the chat. Looks like we have one already started. So, let's see if this is one or two questions. How am I going to ask it? All right. So, when you think about the future state of consuming news online, is there anything that we are seeing on the horizon that excites you, or anything that companies might need to be thinking about to help reach people better?
You know, there's so many options, and it's been a really interesting time just to be in the online news space. We've seen a lot of people dip their toes into it and fail wildly because they're coming at it with an old school model and are trying to apply that to a platform that they're not familiar with. I think that we're gonna see online news continue to grow out into that podcast sector. I think we're gonna see a lot of trial and failure and trial with subscription models. You know, Magnetic is free right into your inbox, definitely worth signing up for. But it's not necessarily a new space, but it's a space that is still being pioneered. And there's just going to be lots of trial and error as some of those old, more established ones try to figure out how to make it work for them.
We don't have any other questions in the chat, but while people keep thinking about them, I have another question for you, Jen. We talked about some great things that we are looking forward to in 2026, but what's something that maybe worries you or you're having concerns over as we kind of roll into this new year?
Um, there's, we haven't touched on Maha at all and its impact on ag. And it's not that I'm concerned with Maha in general, right? But I am concerned that we're going to start implementing policy changes without doing any of the homework ahead of time to make sure our producers have the support they need to make those changes. We saw them just this last week. They pulled all the or one of the big scientific papers that declared glyphosate as acceptable. That got yanked. Roundup is in the news all the time right now. And it's good that we're having those conversations and it's good that we're looking into those things. But what makes me nervous is that we're not arming our producers with the skills and the tools that they need to be successful given that changing environment. If we're going to take these tools away, let's make sure that they are educated and have alternative routes that they can take.
All right, we have a couple in the chat. What is one thing that you hope magnetic ag is known for a year from now?
I hope that we are known for growth. We have when I first came on with magnetic, we had at that time about 8,000 subscribers. And as of this week, we're going into about 38,000 inboxes. And so that has been phenomenal. And I just think, this is the place to be. And it's going to be really fun to see where this can go.
I agree. That number is always really exciting when I open up the back end of things and get to look at it. Another question from the chat. What has been, and we may have covered this already, but they want to know what has been your favorite feel-good story of 2025?
This is feel good in an interesting way. You're gonna have to follow me with this one. So, mental health in rural America is something that has always been a challenge. Mental health with our ag producers is something that has always, been associated with stats that are not pretty. And this year, especially, we have seen, along with the increasing pressure on our farmers, an increase of the industry to provide resources specific to mental health and agriculture. And that has made me so proud of us as a people for acknowledging that this is an issue and here's how we're going to help these communities process it. We just covered a story about some kits that are going out to rural communities to help them handle crisis situations, mental health crisis situations. Every time we cover those, I feel proud of who we are in rural America.
I definitely agree, Jen. That was one of the things that we covered recently on the podcast as well with some mental health stuff, and that was really, really good things to see in ag that we're kind of taking the stigma away from it. So another question in the chat, how do you see the ag media generally adjusting to how this current administration is paying so much attention to social media and and news coverage in general?
Well, you got to be on your toes. You think you got something nailed down and then the administration gets on Truth Social and completely changes course. Really, ag media is gonna have to be online, and this is where the newer forms of media are gonna shine as opposed to, your monthly or weekly newspaper that you're getting. This is where magnetic is uniquely situated because we are twice a week. That gives us enough time to process things through, right? We're not trying to hit your inbox daily, but it also puts us in a position to be very responsive to those tweets. The issue becomes, right, when somebody in the administration completely changes course and backtracks and then what do you do? So yeah, really everybody just has to be on their toes and ready for it.
I love it. All right, we're not going to give away too much of the secret sauce because, Magnetic's growing. But in the chat, someone asked they would like some advice you might give someone that's interested in launching an ag-focused newsletter or some tips to some tips on making that work or some things you've seen work for Magnetic.
Yeah, I would just say surround yourself with a variety of voices. I talked about earlier that one of the things we do well at Magnetic is that we have input from various sectors, and we're such a big industry, you say agriculture and it feels small at first because you're thinking about the shrinking population of America's ranchers and farmers. But the reality is that it is much, much bigger than that. And so, surrounding yourself by voices, that whether or not you're trying to start a newsletter, even if you're just trying to be a responsible citizen, surrounding yourself with a variety of voices helps keep your mind right and helps keep you growing in perspective.
All right, Jen.
And you
This
should
is also
talk to
kind of
us.
a
Just come
oh
work
yeah,
with
just
us
talk to us.
instead.
Just yeah, that's what I'm saying. So this is kind of becoming an AFA, a little bit of an AFA tradition across social media and as well as in podcasts or webinars and questions. What is your ag-related hot take?
Oh gosh, I want
You
to
can have
hear Braeden
multiple.
answer that first. I feel like Braeden should answer that first.
Oh no. What is my hot take? I don't even I think Savannah has to go first.
Okay, so I don't want to isolate people here. But I live in central Nebraska. I'm a rancher. The Tyson closing the Lexington plant has been huge news out here. We have had politicians flooding in and
Mhm.
staging these press conferences where, then somebody kind of turns the camera around and there's 12 people standing there watching. It's not as big a deal as they want to make it. Um, my hot take is that, wow, that really, really sucks. It really sucks that Tyson decided to lay off 3,500 people in a town of 10,000, right? That is horrible for that community. That is terrible. The government shouldn't come in and force them to stay open. That's not really how democracy works. That's my hot take.
All right. All right. Braden's hot take. Here we go. We need to stop worrying about what everyone else in agriculture is doing and how they're producing things and what they think's the best because what works on your farm isn't going to work on Jim John's farm down the street.
Okay, so now you're going to get me going off on a whole tangent. This is what I think certified Angus beef did so well. And I try to tell, well, mine's grass fed, well, mine's not community all the time. Certified Angus beef never told anybody Angus is better because Hereford sucks or because Charolais sucks, right? They just said, we're great and here's why we're great. And I think, love them or hate them, you cannot deny the impact that CAB has had on the ranching industry and the beef market, right? Like it completely shaped the market and they did it without being negative. So you may not like everything that Angus has done, but my goodness, quit caring about what the other people are doing. Quit trying to sell your product by tearing theirs down. You're absolutely right.
Snaps to that. All right, Savannah, do you have your hot take?
I do have a hot take, and I really loved both of yours. My hot take is that us people in agriculture don't do as good of a job as we think we do in connecting with our consumers. I think pe I've noticed people in agriculture say like, "Oh yeah, like consumers want our product and like the beef market, for example, is like going up, demand is going up, so we're doing a great job." Well, that's not, in my opinion, is not fully the case. I think there's still a large disconnect and we need to do better. And I think my second piece of my heart take is that people in agriculture think that they're going to be the ones to bridge that connection, but I think we need to be more welcoming to the people outside of agriculture because, in my opinion, those are the people that have the strongest influence with our consumers. And so we need to be more welcoming so that we can bridge that connection. That's my hot take.
I love it. All right, a question in the chat. We kind of hit on this a little bit earlier, but this is a little bit of a different spin on the question. If you could interview any agriculture influencer, so I'm thinking like social media influencer, like big personality, who would it be and what would you talk about?
So I have really strong feelings about influencer culture in general. I have really strong feelings about anything, everything. By the time we get off, you guys are gonna be like, why did we ever give her a platform? But somebody that I don't think gets enough press and probably should, and maybe a bunch of you will have never heard of her, and so then you'll say, well, she's not really an influencer. But Jolene Brown is out there doing God's work about family transition process in agriculture. And she is not trying to sell anything. I've never seen her make a video where she's telling you that you should go buy this truck for your husband because it has toolboxes and that's like a dress with pockets, right? Like we do these crazy, weird ag influencer things that aren't really telling us anything. And Jolene Brown is out there and she is trying to change our culture so that these family operations are sustainable and can be passed down generationally in a way that allows for those generations to work successfully together. And I just think that she would be so interesting to sit down and talk with because she has probably seen some of the wildest family arguments that should be on television because they would be hilarious and she would be a wild conversation. I also think that Dale Brisby would be super hilarious to talk to because he has bridged some of that gap. Like Savannah was talking about, we have to connect with our consumers and we have to connect with people who are outside of the industry. And people who aren't in the industry, they have heard of Dale Brisby, right? Because he's this comedian and he's out there making funny videos. But then he goes on these huge platforms like Joe Rogan and he talks about meat production. And I think that that is really, really valuable and he would be hilarious. So I would love to visit with him.
You touched on another one of my hot takes.
Well, let's hear it.
The older generation is harming agriculture with their refusal to do farm transition properly. Actually, that's not a hot take, that's just a fact.
And
My
it's
turn.
so hard because a lot of these guys didn't have retirement plans, right? Their retirement plan was my son will buy me out. And then land prices exploded. And now their son can't buy them out. And so everybody's just in this awful hard position. And that's why people like Jolene Brown matter so much because she's able to go in and help them have those conversations and figure out a path forward that doesn't involve just blowing the family up.
Someone mark her down as a guest on AFA's Cultivating Leaders podcast. All right, we have another question in the chat. So, tying back to mental health and your comment around the news just not being fun sometimes, do you have any recommendations on how to take care of yourself while staying in the know during those type of news cycles?
So for me, it involves stepping away. You know, we live on a ranch, so for me, that looks like getting out, whether that's, you know, getting horseback or just going for a drive and doing cow work, right? Reminding myself that even if everything else falls apart, we still have livestock. There's still a world beyond what the is putting out right now. That's really good for me. I think you have to have a life that exists outside of the news cycle.
I love it. All right. If there's no more questions from the chat or from any of our speakers or any of our guests that would want to come off mute and maybe ask a question, I just wanted to thank on behalf of AFA. Thank you, Jen, for joining this partnership webinar with us today. And thank you all for listening in to our first live session of Magnetic Ag Ears Edition. Savannah and I have lots of fun. And it was awesome to kind of merge the two worlds together and get some of Jennifer's input into kind of the process. Just a reminder, you will get a survey hit in your mail inbox after this. So feedback is a gift and we love it and we use it to build and make greater content for all of you to dig into. Also, for those industry professionals in the room today, please look up, that's up in the chat, the link to Alliance X. Registration is live. We would love to have you in an AFA space. And if you're for some reason not subscribed to Magnetic Ag, please subscribe to Magnetic Ag and get it in your inbox. It is kind of the must-need source. It's fun, it's quick, and Jen puts like her blood, sweat, and tears into it, and so do the writers, and it is a really awesome newsletter. And with that, thank you all for being here today.
Thanks, everybody. I hope everybody has a wonderful holiday.